the migration situation is being allowed to happen this way. The smart wall has consistently been a bipartisan project. So you have the Democrats creating the conditions to manufacture consent, and it's the two-party illusion. It's the left hand and the right hand. The left hand is creating the problem, and the right hand's going to come in and ride into the rescue to solve the problem the left hand has created. And it's the exact same system both hands want. And the only winner here is the people that want to create this global technocratic government system that relies on AI mass surveillance to run and control our freedom of movement. It's being sold as this liberty-driven thing that we're going to make America great again and stop illegal immigration and whatnot. But that's not what's going to happen here.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me once again today is Whitney Webb, here to discuss one of her recent articles in regard to the smart wall and the overlap in regard to a very interesting conversation we're going to get into today. We've discussed a lot in the past about the Unit 8200 overlap to the tech community from an Israel push. And this is getting into a conversation of a honeypots of sorts in regard to using these connections to sort of trick conservatives into aligning themselves with projects that are eerily similar to what we're seeing from the United Nations, but of course it's accepted when it comes from a different source, and a lot of other things they'd love to discuss, because it's always a pleasure to talk to Whitney. How are you today? Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's always a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Ryan, for having me. Looking forward to having another conversation with TLAV. Always enjoy it.
Yet another contentious conversation that we'll get. These are always the important ones, the things that are, it's always somewhere in the middle. That's why I think your work is always important in this regard. So let's start with the article we discussed. We have mentioned this before. We've touched on it, but this is this point alone is very obvious to anybody that I think is not pulled into one partisan side or the other. I mean, obviously the border, the wall, going from a wall to a smart wall is the best way to put it, is an interesting shift from Trump's perspective, right? And so go ahead and start wherever you'd like on this and why you think this connects to a larger sort of honeypot sort of manipulation discussion.
Yeah. So first off, the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as Agenda 2030 from the UN, one of the main policy agendas there is to have biometric entry and exit systems for every country. This is being rolled out in lockstep throughout the entire world right now. And this year it's being implemented. I think next month it starts actually being implemented in Europe for foreign travelers entering Europe. The UK rolls it out next year. And of course, there's a big push to do it in the US and also in other countries. It's intimately tied up with the whole digital ID agenda that's been ongoing for a very long time, and particularly during the COVID era, as I'm sure you are aware and your audience is aware, there was a big push against digital ID and vaccine passports, which were sort of a beta test for the digital ID system during the COVID era. And currently we are seeing an effort to manufacture consent among right-leaning Americans who opposed vaccine passports and digital ID to get them to go along with this biometric entry exit agenda. That's at its core a globalist agenda, and also an intelligence-linked surveillance agenda. I mean, fundamentally the same at the end of the day, but under different rhetoric. And so essentially what we've had over the past year, right, is a lot of increased attention paid by the media to the situation on the US-Mexico border. It's important to point out that the US-Mexico border for decades and decades has been very insecure. And even though rhetoric has been different between presidents, no president, including Trump, has ever shut down that border. No one has constructed a physical barrier. Trump campaigned on that, but by 2019 had pivoted away from a physical barrier, what he called at that point a medieval wall. No medieval walls, he said. No, we're going to have a smart wall. Yeah. And the smart wall is not a physical wall at all. It's enabled by drones and AI, surveillance cameras, surveillance towers that dot the U.S.-Mexico border. And this is actually an effort that precedes Trump significantly. It was first launched after 9/11 as SBI-Net by the newly created DHS. And was relatively unsuccessful because of, I think it was like Boeing and some other, super bloated, corrupt U.S. government contractors that were creating a system owned by the government, and they were, milking money and being incompetent and slow to like make profit, as contractors or the big ones, are wont to do. And so in comes this new startup by this guy named Palmer Luckey, who was part of the Peter Thiel network. Probably best known, Palmer Luckey, for creating Oculus Rift, the virtual reality system that was sold to Facebook, which Facebook, again, is a company that was essentially, we think of Mark Zuckerberg as creating it, but it would not exist without Peter Thiel, who was the person that turned Facebook into the company it is and was on its board for a very long time. So Palmer Luckey, involved with Facebook and then leaves, and then Thiel starts funding his defense startup, AI defense startup, called Anduril, which is tied up with this same network of companies Thiel is responsible for that are contractors to the military and intelligence communities of the U.S., including Palantir, of course, being the main a company in that web, but Anduril is intimately connected because of people like Trey Stevens, who's been at Palantir, works for Thiel's Founders Fund. Founders Fund invested in Anduril. Trey Stevens co-created Anduril with Palmer Luckey. Trey Stevens was also involved with Trump's DoD transition team, which Peter Thiel was also intimately involved in. And Trey Stevens was also on the board and still is on the board of Carbine 911, which is the 911 emergency system company that was heavily funded by Jeffrey Epstein, basically created by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Unit 8200 officials to take over essentially the US 911 call system and turn it into like a system that has pre-crime and extreme surveillance functionality. So Trey Stevens is involved with that crowd. And within Carbine 911 is a woman named Lital Lashim, a career Israeli intelligence operative who currently works for Eric Prince of Blackwater fame, who is also very much inserted into this network and the network behind the Trump administration, essentially. So these are, and it's important to point out too, Anduril, Palantir, Trey Stevens, Peter Thiel, these guys all have extreme CIA connections, extreme deep state connections. This is the supposed deep state that Trump supporters are supposed to hate. And they are the ones building the smart wall. And this, obviously there's a very insecure and troubling situation on the border, but people only care about it because it's being given extreme media attention and, concern about it is being drummed up as a way to manufacture consent for something must be done. And the something that must be done, of course, is the smart wall. And this is being pitched within independent media by people like Brett Weinstein on Tucker Carlson, being pitched by people like Colonel Douglas McGregor, who also, I believe, had some sort of advisory role in the Trump administration. And unfortunately, the smart wall is not something that's going to promote individual liberty or freedom. It is this exact same UN biometric entry and exit system that depends heavily on digital ID. And digital ID is the core of this whole social credit surveillance system that conservatives and Trump supporters and right-leaning Americans are ostensibly very against. But they're being sold the building blocks of that as the only way, right, to effectively stop the migration situation. But of course, the migration situation is being allowed to happen this way. It is intentional. Right. This is not a mistake. It's not incompetence. It's happening on purpose. And the smart wall has consistently been a bipartisan project. Democrats love it and Republicans love it. And it's been that way for more than 20 years when it was first being launched by DHS. So you have the Democrats creating the conditions to manufacture consent, and it's the two-party illusion. It's the left hand and the right hand. The left hand is creating the problem, and the right hand's going to come in and right into the rescue to solve the problem the left hand has created. And it's the exact same system both hands want. And the only winner here is the people that want to create this global technocratic government system that relies on AI mass surveillance to run and control our freedom of movement. And where it's being sold as this liberty-driven thing that we're going to make America great again and stop illegal immigration and whatnot. But that's not what's going to happen here. And it's also worth pointing out that some of these other figures on the American right, or rather within the Republican Party, people like Ron DeSantis, who, for example, has taken this rather outspoken posture on CBDCs, right, as a tool of surveillance. CBDCs are bad. Well, I'll never allow CBDCs in Florida, et cetera. Well, Florida is among the most advanced states under DeSantis with the digital ID agenda, creating Florida Smart ID with a company that's like, was one of the most notorious promoters of digital ID with the World Economic Forum during the COVID era. I think it's Tails or Thales is how I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It's a French company. And I believe they're like military contractors as well. And they have this rather infamous video about promoting the digital ID system. And anyway, that's who's been contracted by the state of Florida to create these digital IDs. So CBDCs are bad, but digital IDs are good, I guess, if they're made by the private sector. I don't know. But remember that what we're fighting here is a public-private partnership. That's how the UN works. That's what the WEF is really about. And I think, unfortunately, there's been a lot of manipulation within independent media to make people think that this all comes solely from the public sector. The UN is the public sector, the WEF, big government, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, the WEF is not big government. The WEF is about promoting public-private partnership. The UN functions almost exclusively in public-private partnerships. And what happens in that case is that it's the public sector is the enabling environment for policies created by the public sector. And this isn't like free market private sector either. This is the crony capitalist, oligarch, financial criminal people that have been sitting on top and have been, finding new ways to steal and enslave us for a very long time.
It just sort of allows a private room for the same government entities to pretend like they're not working in a government capacity. Right. I mean, along with everything else, like it's just like this complete. I think we've talked about this a lot about the shell game of the public-private partnership. It's just such a scam, in my opinion. It's very obvious. I mean,
they'll blame the public sector for something, and then the private sector will ride in to solve the problem, and then the private sector becomes the problem, and the public sector comes in to rein in but it's all the same people at the end of the day, but they just switch around. It's either left or right or public or private. They have to keep you ping-ponging you around so you don't figure out what's actually going on. And I think it's very unfortunate that there's a lot of prominent people in independent media that are promoting this agenda, whether they're intentionally doing so because they've been paid to do so, or whether they've unwittingly been sold by other figures that this is a good idea. It is not a good idea.
I completely agree. Before we get into the different ways that digital ID, the biometrics and what kind of things we're talking about there, in regard to the Unit 8200 Israeli overlap in that conversation, and then overlapping that with the larger point you're making about the globalization, which I think everybody at least some degree understands what that means in regard to the different World Economic Forum pushes and the biometrics and all of that. But how do you see the Israeli element of that playing into it? Do you see that as simply part of the global governance dynamic? Because it's hard for me to see it that way with the way things are playing out in the world stage right now, but maybe we're all just being misled. But how do you see that Unit 8200, like the Carbine 911 and all these different companies tied to Israeli intelligence kind of overtaking US entities? Is that the same agenda in your mind, or are they separate things?
I mean, I think it certainly could be the same agenda. So if you think about, for example, the first president of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, he gave some very odd prediction of what the world would be in the future back in like the 50s or something. And it was about like a global government, a one world government, but the capital of the government is in Jerusalem. And Israel essentially has an outside role in like leading this global government. So it's not necessarily that like, oh, there's like this push for Israeli supremacism within this current extremist government in Israel. That whole idea is not necessarily incompatible with a global governance agenda. And I think it's been very clear for some time, at least under Netanyahu's time as prime minister of Israel as it relates to the cybersecurity agenda that he has overseen in the development of Israel's cybersecurity sector, and how he's essentially eliminated any differentiation between Unit 8200 and Israeli intelligence and that sector. That's been very deliberate, the seeding of it within major parts of the U.S. government, the U.S. corporate world, and of course, countries beyond the U.S. That's been very deliberate. It was framed initially, I mean, it's an admitted policy. It was initially framed within the U.S. as being a way to prevent the United States from ever meaningfully supporting in any way the BDS or boycott, divest, sanctions movement. But really, it's a way for Israel to have, undue influence over, American foreign policy decisions. But it obviously is more than that. The U.S. national security state is truly binational and has been for decades. It's U.S. and Israel. The deep state in the U.S. is, if you look at Iran-Contra and numerous other scandals of the deep state, it's been the U.S. and Israel together for a very long time. Israel also has a deep state, which is something that I think a lot of conservatives in the United States overlook routinely, and that the U.S. deep state, when it wants to get away with something, so specifically among conservatives, uses the Israeli deep state to accomplish it, because there's it's taboo to criticize Israel in lots of conservative circles. And they definitely use that to their advantage, I think, to a significant degree. But anyway, Netanyahu's policy is to have cybersecurity and Israeli dominance of that particular field be used to ensure that Israel, despite its size and population size and geographic size, has undue influence over the over future events and future paradigms of governance. And so I think, regardless of how this plays out, I think Israel is very content to have some sort of global government system as long as it's given a preeminent role. And of course, people that have been talking about the pushes for global government and one world government for a very long time have also talked about the advent of that coinciding with one world religion and the launch of that. And in the UAE, I think it happened recently, actually, they've created this singular building that's supposed to be a place of worship for all the Abrahamic religions, and sort of making an amalgamation of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and having that being seated in the Holy Land and all of that. So it's very possible that all these things could be related at some future date. Unfortunately, it kind of complicates analysis of what's really going on. The fact of what we've seen over the past several years, a lot of people, I think, have been kind of stuck in the paradigms that dominated independent media before COVID-19. Because during COVID, we saw all these different countries on ostensible, opposing sides. U.S. empire and adversary states of U.S. empire, all agreeing about COVID-19 policy, all agreeing about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are completely designed by Western bankers. Why are Russia and China and Iran, rolling over for that? And that's not just COVID too, right? Sustainable Development Goals extend far beyond that, but also include that. And they're all following these policy agendas as well, including like biometric entry exit systems, the whole smart wall idea. All these countries are doing that. So I think that makes it harder to take the whole idea of multipolarity seriously without, interrogating why that might be, right? And so how much of this at the geopolitical level is not necessarily theatrical. People are dying. The suffering is very real. But are the elites on the top? What are their goals? It seems like the neo-feudal paradigm is essentially, the technocracy neo-feudal paradigm is shared by elites in Russia and China just as much as it is by the elites of the EU and the United States. And there have been predictions from a long time, probably the most infamous of, people like Albert Pike in the 1800s, that the Third World War would be between, the Zionists and the Muslims, and that it would, allow for, when the ashes settle on the complete destruction of a third world war, that there would be, you know, a global government essentially, and, you know, order out of chaos and all of that. So how much is, you know, how much of this is planned to go that route? How much of it is organic? I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of people are very emotionally invested in particular narratives and unable to really look at a lot of this objectively. But, you know, and I think also when people interrogate a lot of these things that were taken for granted maybe before COVID, it's not necessarily that there's an intent or interest in minimizing the suffering, especially of the Palestinians who have been test beds for this exact system that is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You know, the Israeli tech tested there is exported elsewhere to implement these policy agendas.
Well, we've seen Lavender, we've seen Habsora, like the different AI elements come out already. They've talked about, you know, and discussing that.
And
so
that's something
that's directly connected to the. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, that stuff was never intended to stay in Palestine, and they routinely had been testing the stuff for this coming global government system on voiceless, vulnerable populations. Obviously, the Palestinians fall in that category, but there's other people as well that have been beta tested for digital ID in very predatory ways. For example, the stateless people that live between Myanmar and Thailand, like they don't have any citizenship anywhere, and they were one of the beta tests for digital ID involving some NGO that was like known for sex trafficking and stuff. I mean, very predatory and nasty stuff. Has been going on for a long time, and they test it on populations that are vulnerable, and then they export it elsewhere. So essentially the situation we have is that we have groups like that, you know, like the Palestinians, and then groups that essentially are that, but haven't realized they are that yet. Because this global government paradigm is essentially here, and we're left squabbling over, what side are we going to choose? Are we going to choose Democrat or Republican? Are we going to choose U.S. empire or the BRICS countries? Are we, you know, and both sides agree about this totalitarian nightmare, unfortunately. Obviously, I would say that there are people that do not agree with that within the governments of each, certainly at lower ranks than the higher ranks, you know, and that I think there's definitely those people that think these conflicts are organic, but I think unfortunately at the highest levels, the 0.1% of the global oligarchy, there is an interest in creating as much chaos as possible in order to force the implementation of the things that the SDGs explicitly discuss that every country in the world has signed on to, and which are very, 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 very bad.
Well, on the note of the digital ID, you bring up the interesting point about the, you know, the battle tested conversation, which a lot of people have covered over the years, just with munitions, you know, bombs, and selling them battle tested because they've been used in the Palestinians. The Lavender AI system, which is more of the person focused aspect, or the Habsora aspect, or called the gospel when translated, is the general building focus point. But there's also, and these are all AI murder systems, essentially. There's also the aspect of the whole UNRWA overlap, the right of return, and how there's been in Israeli leadership, people speaking on the record saying that what they're doing to Palestinians in the north, where nobody's really able to view and see what's happening, is forcing them on the record to renounce their right of return and their right to their Palestinian heritage. And essentially at that point, signing up in digital ID process. Now that's been stated by more than one, hasn't been publicly announced, but I feel like this is a very alarming overlap to what we're seeing, how it's just sort of this force. Now, you could argue that is a tangential agenda to whatever else is happening, but maybe it's the primary. I don't know. Either way, it's clearly tied into something much larger that affects all of us. And I think that's what you're kind of highlighting here, is this world around.
It absolutely is intended to go beyond Palestine, but it's being tested in Palestine in a way that is incredibly inhumane and extremely difficult to watch and heart-wrenching. The suffering there is unbelievable, and it is very real. But there's a lot of different things that are planned for there. And this is coming from people like, you know, Jared Kushner's recent comments, but also people like Steve Mnuchin, for example, who was Trump's Treasury Secretary and is now chairman of the board of the satellite surveillance firm called Satellogic, that I recently put out an article about, that is about to literally basically start surveilling all of Latin America for the purposes of debt slavery of the global South. And Steve Mnuchin, and looking at the Gaza situation during the so-called deal of the century and the Abraham Accords and all of this, discussed how his vision for Gaza was to turn it into a hot IPO, or initial public offering, essentially treating, its people and also its, resources, its land as, financial products. And so when you are onboarded to the digital ID system, which again is a system created by oligarchs, big tech oligarchs, and bankers, you become the financial product. And that has been a lot of this paradigm of moving away from a post-oil economy into the data economy, is that you are the source of the data. Right. You are the product.
And so the Oculus overlap and the metaverse and like tokenization, gamification of everything.
Yes, with the tokenization stuff. So the idea is to give everything a unique number, ID number, and have it all be on the same ledger, the same blockchain, right? And that is essentially what this digital ID stuff is about. And the efforts to do this in Palestine are longstanding. And it's not just Palestine, it's everywhere. And it's also the natural world. It's not just people, it's everything that's alive. Carbon-based life. This is where the whole idea of carbon markets being one of the pillars of the coming new financial paradigm that includes CBDCs and programmable surveillable money. Carbon is a big focus of that, because the idea is to monetize and tokenize carbon and use it as a way. We have this huge debt problem in the world, so they have to find all these debt sinks for it. And so a part of this is by adding new assets to the economy, and that's by turning the entire natural world into a new asset class. They've been doing this for a couple of years, the idea of natural asset corporations, and financializing nature by other means, the so-called nature-based solutions, the debt for nature swaps, which are, essentially land grabs. And the whole idea of carbon credits too opens up the door to land grabs, because when you buy a carbon credit, it enters into this whole situation, this murky legal field of what are known as carbon rights. Who has the right to the carbon in the forest that the carbon credit represents, right?
That's crazy.
It's very crazy. And this is not legally defined, but the carbon market is marching forward. So I definitely foresee carbon markets and the idea of carbon credits supposedly to conserve and save the planet just being a mechanism for insane land grabs. And they're going to also do this with Bitcoin, since Bitcoin has a limited supply of how many can be produced. It can serve as a debt sink for the dollar, money printing, whatever, even though like Bitcoiners like to say, oh, Bitcoin is a hedge against central bank money printing and financial, or rather fiscal irresponsibility, it can be used. And the plan is to use it to enable that irresponsibility. And that's why people like Larry Fink love it. Even Jeffrey Epstein, I learned a couple months ago, gave in one single interview where he talked about Bitcoin and was like, it's great, but it's not a currency. So it's digital assets. It's a technology for asset storage. And what that means is...
Well, go ahead. I want to interrupt. Go ahead. I want to ask a question about the carbon part. So finish your thought.
Oh, no, just that they can use it as a debt sink, so they can keep printing money. But because, the Bitcoin value will go up the more they hyperinflate the dollar, they can just, continue the same crap that way, and by also creating this new asset class. So they have a lot of plans for keeping all this stuff going, but it's going to be, instead of enslaving people with like bad toxic debt, like, exploded in 2008 and like exploded in the 80s and all of that stuff, they're now going to turn the natural world into debt, basically, and you into debt. And, there's human capital, there's social capital, there's natural capital, our very being, what we do in our lives, our careers, our social relationships, our social networks, and the natural world are all going to become financial products. And it can't happen without digital ID, and it can't happen without the ledger, the blockchain.
Right. This puts a whole new spin to the phrase you coined, your body is the new battlefield, doesn't it? It really does add a whole other element to that. Now, what you described there, I just recently played a clip that I was trying to understand, and I wasn't sure if I fully understood what he was getting at. And my point was, I'll play this clip for you really quickly. It's short. Is that it seems like, well, what you're saying, like taking like an example from banking, is that just by claiming that because the banking situation is set up the way it is, that everybody will partake in it, which will benefit the system, is not accurate when you realize that people can short and they can, and then in real world situations, create the negative circumstances to that benefit from. So do you see that also being the same conversation here, where you could essentially destroy things, or right? Isn't that the same dynamic?
Oh,
Am I
yeah.
wrong in that?
So there
That's
was the
terrifying.
scandal in the 1980s, the junk bond scandal, and
Mhm.
it was tied up with the savings and loans crisis. And essentially the junk bonds were being like created
Right.
out of this bank called Drexel Burnham Lambert by this guy, Michael Milken, and they were being used to fuel the takeover of corporations by corporate raiders, who were a lot of these organized crime, intelligence connected figures, a lot of whom were tied to Jeffrey Epstein, who had a lot of ties to people that came from Drexel Burnham Lambert or the corporate raiders. That were essentially being turned into the corporate titans. You know, they were being allowed to take over large swaths of corporate America, fueled by this junk bond stuff, and tied up with the savings and loans crisis, which involved the Bush family, the Reagan, CIA, networks, and all of that, along with, a lot of organized crime people. I talk about it a lot in volume 1 of my book. And so the same people responsible for junk bonds are behind carbon trading. The person that created carbon credit trading is Richard Sandor, who, after Drexel Burnham Lambert collapsed, he had been a senior vice president at Drexel Burnham Lambert during the junk bond scandal. He created carbon trading at the behest of, first he was brought in by Bush Sr. in the early 90s to develop emissions trading for sulfur dioxide, a free market solution to the environmental problem of acid rain. And after that, Sandor was brought to the UN by Maurice Strong, who's a very deeply Rockefeller-connected figure, who created the summit that was responsible for launching Agenda 21, now Agenda 2030. And he proposed the same thing for climate change, carbon emissions to combat climate change, which at that time, climate change had, it's a rather interesting evolution, but you have groups like the Club of Rome that had been, essentially eugenics rebranded, which the Rockefellers had been doing as well, since they're one of the earliest funders of eugenics in the United States and also the United Kingdom and also Nazi Germany, among other places, and sort of rebranded as, environmental movements. We have to reduce the population to save the planet and deindustrialize to save the planet and move to a whole new system of economics for the planet and all this stuff. But it's not about the planet. As noted in one of the Club of Rome's books, they say, the way to get people to support these policies is to make humanity the enemy of humanity, to make people hate humans, make humans hate themselves, a self-hate thing, and blame themselves. And so, you have this urgency. If we don't do this, everyone will die. And so we must have the carbon market. And you must participate. It's currently called the voluntary carbon market, but the plan is to only make it voluntary in name only, just like the vaccine passports.
The connection you just made to the connection you just made to the junk bond, that's crazy to me, that we can have somebody who is central to such clear manipulation be the beginning of the carbon tax idea. I mean, this is why your work is important.
Sander is also the guy that created collateralized mortgage obligations, which caused the 2008 financial crisis. These are career financial criminals. This is the guy behind carbon markets. And carbon markets are so fraud and grift prone that they have not been able to work. And there's this big effort among the oligarchs to create high integrity carbon markets and improve confidence in them, because no one has any confidence in them because there's been so many scandals that the credits are worthless and meaningless. So the response is not to tackle the fraud in the industry, it's to make people buy insurance on the carbon credits.
Of course, just in case they're all liars, right?
Create a new market for the insurance companies too, because the idea is to forcibly force people to participate in this market, right? And the only people that will be able to afford carbon offsets to live normally will be the elite, and everyone else will be, taxed to death, essentially, all by digital means.
Who just so happen to also be the biggest polluters, so they'll just get to pay to keep doing all the big polluting, and so nothing really changes. Exactly.
Yes. And so I mentioned Steve Mnuchin earlier and how he has essentially taken over the satellite firm, chairs the board, along with the guy that was head of Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump, Joseph Dunford, who are both tied up with Cyber Reason now as well, which we've talked about many times,
Right.
the Unit 8200 front company. And that satellite company is now entering into a program. They launch satellites later this month to surveil all of Latin America, with the goal of creating this carbon market and surveilling carbon emissions from space. And it's very bad, as you can imagine, but this is where the debt barons are going.
Let me play this clip for you, and we'll go ahead, finish your thought.
No, it's all good.
Okay, well, let me play this clip for you, and I just want you give me some contextualize what he's saying here in the context of what you were just saying, and maybe now that you've explained all this, this will be more clear. I played this day before yesterday, I think, and I think I understand what he's getting at here, and I think it's just this kind of like tokenization of natural things. But I want to make sure that this is what we're talking about, and at the very least, this will add an example to what you're saying.
So central banks are also starting to understand nature has real value. Carbon, we already figured out. And carbon is moving very quickly into a system where it's going to be very close to a currency. Basically being able to take a ton of absorbed or sequestered carbon and being able to create a forward pricing curve with financial service architecture, documentation. I just came out of a meeting this morning, how we're trying to accelerate that. To be quite honest, not to get very boring, that we're on financial topics and things, but they're going to be derivatives. And you need ISDA documentation if you want to trade a derivative in the marketplace. And all of this actually matters for nature as well. I'm going to quickly hand off, but again, I want to talk about value one more time, because the southern part of the world has value far greater than large elements of the northern part.
They're going to steal the resources.
Start thinking about and putting prices
through debt
on water, on trees, on biodiversity.
This is Richard Sanders' whole
we
thing.
find, where does that sit? I'm doing a lot of work out of Asia, and I say that my next door neighbor, Indonesia, is the left lung of the world, and obviously Brazil's the right, and Africa, absolutely critical. And we need their natural capital as a system-based world more than we need that 66 billion we've got sitting in the basement of the Bank of England. So how do we, and I'm hoping this discussion today, at least from a central banker's point of view, on how do we start tokenizing, how do we start building systems that actually create not only the value, but transfer that value around the world.
Think about that. Like, okay, so this is exactly what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a whole article about this with my colleague, who's editor-in-chief of Bitcoin Magazine, Mark Goodwin. We just put out a piece called "The Carbon Credit Coup." Well, debt from above, the carbon credit coup. That's about this specifically. It's going to be a 2-part series. And man, so Richard Sanders, who I talked about earlier, and so yes, he was at Drexel Burnham Lambert. Before that, he invented derivatives. He's the father of derivatives, the collateral mortgage obligation. He helped fuel the junk bond stuff at Drexel Burnham Lambert. He created carbon trading. These are the same guys, the same financial criminals who have robbed people and enslaved people with debt. This is their new game. And it is coming for the natural world. It is coming for the global south. The idea is, I don't know if you're familiar, but people like Mark Carney, Larry Fink have been talking about for years, in order to solve climate change, we need to rethink and reimagine the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, which, since they were created, have been all about debt slavery. The World Bank, the IMF, that's what they've done time and time again. It's a well-documented phenomenon. The idea is to reinvent them so that the debt slavery model moves into this new paradigm they've created, where it's digital ID based, digital wallet based. The World Bank is currently creating climate wallets with Google and a lot of these giant companies. Pretty much every big corporation in the world is part of this organization called IETA, or the International Emissions Trading Association, that are all on board for creating this kind of stuff. This is the new system. There is the agenda, as he very clearly stated there, to turn carbon into a currency. And that's why they are tokenizing carbon credits. Adam Newman, who had, created WeWork, right? And it collapsed because he was like so insane while managing that company. His new company is a tokenizer of carbon credits called Flow Carbon, and their tokenized carbon credit token is called the Goddess Nature token. I mean, these are complete financial criminals who are claiming that they're saving the planet, but they are just planning to rob not just you, but the entire natural world of its wealth.
Calling all grifters, right? Anybody who wants to jump in, right? It's just so ridiculous. So the same classic grifters who are,
I mean, just waiting for Sam Bankman-Fried to get out of prison and launch his like tokenized carbon new business or whatever. It's insane. It's truly insane. And so a lot of the people that are involved in this effort to do this in the global South, as I mentioned earlier, you have like Steve Mnuchin chairing the board of this company that's also like intimately tied to like DARPA, DHS, the NSA. These are the people surveilling Latin America for the planet now, enabled by Elon Musk's SpaceX, which is launching these satellites into space.
Of course.
So much for him being libertarian free speech. He's literally creating a panopticon for the natural world with these guys. One of the other people on the board is this guy named Howard Lutnick, who some people may know for being Jeffrey Epstein's neighbor in New York and having bought his townhouse from those guys. But essentially, he's the head of this company called Cantor Fitzgerald, which is this financial services company that was one of the earliest earliest companies involved in sulfur dioxide trading that Richard Sandor created, and also carbon trading going back to the late 90s. And some interesting stuff going on there with their like patents for digital carbon markets. And then their offices get directly targeted by the plane on 9/11. Everyone dies, but Howard Lutnick, essentially. And then they're relaunched under, interesting new paradigms. And then, but anyway, currently, he's one of the biggest holders, Cantor Fitzgerald, of U.S. Treasury bills, and also one of the biggest entities connected to the U.S. dollar stablecoin Tether, which is also a big part of the FTX scandal, because FTX was very involved in managing the Tether supply. And there's a big push here, and we're seeing it in a big way with Argentina. The more destabilized economies become, particularly in the global South, the more they are flocking to these dollar-denominated stable coins. And this is Tether has openly admitted that they are a willing tool of the U.S. government to expand and deepen U.S. dollar hegemony. They've onboarded the FBI and the Secret Service onto their platform. They're being marketed as a way to bank the unbanked by people in the crypto space. It's being framed as freedom money. It's not freedom money.
Well, it's just like the same point we were just making. You could and not to say that we can prove it's happening, but you can clearly argue there's a motivation to create destabilization to justify the market. I mean, and you could even argue
it's to onboard people.
You could even argue
it's to onboard people onto these new
to do so. Let's go ahead. There's a delay. Go ahead.
Oh. No, well, the destabilization is about onboarding people onto these new systems. Argentina, for example, before Milei was elected, 60% of the population was in poverty, under the poverty line. Now it's worse because he got into office and devalued their currency by a further 50% right away. And people are so desperate that they're all signing up for WorldCoin and record numbers.
Right.
Scanning their eyeball and getting shit coins in exchange for a digital ID that's backed by the PayPal mafia like Reid Hoffman. And as you know, the recent article I put out with Mark goes into detail about this. The people setting all this stuff up in Argentina, including the satellite firm, which was created by Argentinians, the Steve Mnuchin one, and a lot of these other companies like Mercado Libre, for example, some of the big titans of the South American corporate world are all tied up with these very close-knit networks that involve essentially the PayPal mafia, which is, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, these big tech oligarchs. But, in Argentina, they have like an Argentinian branch, and that's who's essentially like running that for South America, obviously with the involvement of people like Reid Hoffman rather directly. But it's a very disconcerting. And so this particular group, the PayPal mafia, which of course also includes Elon Musk, among others, are making a very big play here for dominance of the Americas specifically, and they're framing it to appeal to liberty-minded people. So they're definitely going to be testing a lot of this stuff out under Milei to see if it sticks. It's very likely that it will come back in a big way when Trump is put in office. I'm convinced that Trump will be the next president. It doesn't matter how we get there. It's very clear that's the plan. So regardless of what shenanigans happen in the election, Trump's going to be in office. So you're going to have this big shift where it's framed as, oh, the deep state has been defeated. Bolsonaro will probably come back to Brazil, and there will be this effort to regionally integrate the Americas. They'll frame it as a freedom thing, but it's not a freedom thing. Remember, the way the EU happened, the EU first happened because they created a free trade agreement throughout Europe. And then there was a goal that there was NAFTA in the United States. And the goal is to you economically integrate, and then you do, governance, integrate regional governance, which is a stepping stone to one global government. Because one global government was not just ever going to be one government for everybody. It's regional governments, continent-wide governments, broken up into big regions, and then they're one government together. I mean, the people that have designed global governance, like the Rockefeller funded entities, for example, it's always been that type of model. And so to get there, you have to make a European Union, you have to make a South American Union, you have to make a North American Union, you have to make an African Union. I mean, all of this stuff essentially already exists. The problem is South America has been divided about how they regionally integrate along political lines. So you have right-leaning South American Union prototypes like Mercosur. You have Prosur. Javier Milei is a big proponent of Mercosur, which is essentially about getting Brazil and Argentina stuck together because they're the biggest countries. Once you stick those two together, it's very easy to get the rest, right? And so before Milei came in, Lula and Fernandez, who was the guy that Milei replaced, were integrating and talking about creating a South American currency called the SUR, just like the euro, but for South American, we're looking to integrate. But now that Milei's there, he doesn't want to work with Lula, so likely we'll have Bolsonaro come back, and then Milei and Bolsonaro will do it, but it will be about freedom, they'll say. But it's not going to be about freedom. This is all a ploy. It's the left-right illusion, two-party illusion thing. But they're going to frame it as that. And I think Nayib Bukele in El Salvador is going to play a big role in this, what can essentially be described as a psyop to make people think that we're moving into this liberty focused model, but it's not really that. The Bukele model for security is people are clamoring for it all over South America because of, like the US, engineered mass migration and rises in crime, and in South America, rises in narco-terrorism. But the narco-terrorists in Latin America have always been funded by the US government and the CIA, always. And they do that when they want military dictatorships installed. And they did that in the 80s, and they are gearing up to do that again. And Nayib Bukele, his big thing is create mega prisons and imprison people that are organized, that they say are organized criminals. And I'm sure there are organized criminals in that bunch, but it's eliminating habeas corpus, no trial, right? This is not how we create liberty-focused societies. Right.
Well, I think
there's no mention of the U.S. intelligence role in creating these organized crime groups, these drug cartels that dominate Latin America. The Sinaloa cartel is obviously run by the CIA. Pablo Escobar was run by the CIA. That's now admitted. That's how this works. And it's a problem, reaction, solution thing. And the solution we're being sold is military on the streets, giant mega prisons, and no habeas corpus. That's like the Patriot Act on steroids. That's not freedom, but it's being marketed this way, and it's very troubling, I think, because I think unfortunately a lot of people are falling for it and thinking that this represents a win against the so-called deep state. But this is just the other arm of the deep state getting what it wanted all along, which is complete surveillance, complete authoritarian, totalitarian control. And as far as El Salvador goes, one of Nayib Bukele's best friend is this Israeli tech oligarch, and that guy's company, he has this Israeli tech company, AI surveillance company, that are covering San Salvador and AI surveillance cameras as a way to ensure security. The same AI pre-crime biosurveillance agenda is rolling out there too. This is not freedom. And the person, this whole satellite carbon credit spying surveillance thing that the last article I put out talks about, one of the main groups behind that is called CC35, and the guy that's going to take over CC35 is the current mayor of San Salvador, a close political ally of Bukele, whose name is Mario Duran. And he's going to be taking that over. He's current vice president for CC35 and a big advocate of this carbon trading bullshit. I mean, it's just that's not good. I mean, this is not freedom flavored anything. Bukele refers to himself as the world's coolest dictator. Okay, maybe that's cool. Pinochet wore sunglasses. Did that make him cool? I don't think so. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cheerleading on for political saviors, but the United States is making a huge play for America hegemony, and that America includes North, Central, and South America. To think that the United States is losing, that the dollar is going to collapse, the U.S. empire is totally going to implode. It is about to really clamp down on the rest of the Americas in a very significant way, and it's going to be very bad. How exactly we get there, I don't know, but I know what's clear is that conservatives are being psyoped into cheering on a lot of this stuff that they would be up in arms about if it was the left doing it.
Right. And so that perfectly brings us back to the opening part of this, right? So the smart wall, the surveillance, so the connection between the carbon tax and the whole carbon manipulation to the smart aspect of it. Can you piece that together for the average person? Like, how does that all come together as this rolls forward?
Sorry, state that again really quick.
You have the carbon tax, climate change, mode of mobilization, that whole thing happening. You've got the smart wall, biometrics. So is it just the digital ID? Is that the connective piece between all of it, or is there more?
That's part of it, but it's this idea of having everything be a financial product. If you want to have complete control over the market, you have to completely surveil everything that's happening. That's why a lot of these, so for example, Ghislaine Maxwell's secret husband, Scott Borgeson, ran this firm called Cargometrics. And essentially what Cargometrics was a way of surveilling the oceans and shipping containers and their movements. And then it morphed from that into a hedge fund, precisely because when you have that type of surveillance data, you can get an edge in trading on markets. And so the more surveillance data you have, the better your trades are, the more money you make. So that's part of it. But the other part is that the idea is to, of the complete surveillance thing, is having complete ordered control of everything that comes in and out of your system, right? And that's why, the ledger, the blockchain is a big part of this, because you have to have the traceability. So if you look, for example, about like how the World Economic Forum talks about supply chains, blockchain is a big part of it. Traceability is a big part of it. They're selling it as, look how great this is going to be. You're going to be able to track every product from its origin to where you buy it and pick it up and see its whole story from beginning to end. But it's really, it's not just a story. I mean, that's how it's being sold to people, to the public. It's really about, traceability and control at the end of the day. You can control stuff more easily when you know where everything is and where it's going. And it's the same reason they're doing that for commodities, and they're doing that for people, to know exactly who's coming in and out of countries, control of freedom of movement. It's ultimately all about control at the end of the day. And a lot of it is actually about money at the end of the day. But that part kind of gets, those two aspects of it often are siloed when we're talking about it. But for these people, it's essentially the same, because now we are the commodities.
Right.
Also.
And so let's bring this back to something you said right in the beginning in regard to individual tracking, bodies even. And so like what you mentioned there just triggered something interesting. Maybe we could talk more afterward in regard to the shipping container tracking. I recently covered something. This goes back to this, even the videos they made. This website is gone now. It was called Dust Networks. It went back over 12 years. And what he was discussing in one of these videos we discussed in our recent show was using smart dust. And even in the videos, he shows him scattering like sand in the air, like as kind of giving you an analogy or like a, visualization of what it would look like, throwing the smart dust in the air and talking about tracking shipping containers across the ocean. So I'm going, well, that means that at least 12 plus years ago, they were actively in the open testing smart dust. There's no way around that. And these were government contracts. So you can watch the videos yourself. Yeah. And so that really concerned me. And so what I'm pointing out is this brings for me back into a more extreme step about what we're talking about. So just what you discussed in regard to carbon tracking, smart, biometric tracking, all of this stuff is real. We know what's happening, but to take it to what is possibly the next step, or I worry is already happening, I want getting into the idea about the idea of smart dust and the tracking therein. I had something I was going to pull up really quickly if I can find it. Here we go. So this was a show I just recently did, and this brings it to Israel and everything. I found this to be really interesting. A 10-year-old TED Talk from an Israeli scientist discussing a Pfizer-funded product that was a syringe-delivered nanotechnology. And I just thought this was crazy to think about. In this video, he talks about giving your body an IP address, using Xbox controllers to be able to deliver and deliver payloads and X, Y, and Z. And I've actually got the video right here of this guy talking about it. DNA origami. Even Bill Gates has talked about that. TED Talk. And this is from 10 years ago. So I just want your thoughts on this and like where ultimately, this goes. And I'll grab the Pfizer document as well, just for in case, always be skeptical. We should be, so people can see that, or this is one of them. Pfizer collaborates with these DNA robots. Right. So what are your thoughts on this? Just kind of wrap up the end where, is this where we should be worried about? Is this the distant future? Is this already happening? Is this even part of the same conversation? How do you see this?
No, it is part of the same conversation, but it's sort of a different side of it. So, ultimately at the end of the day, this is control over commodities. So now that we're the commodity, it's also control over, for body their tracking. Security, not for ours, over how humans perceive reality. And so a lot of what's going on with AI is that. And then there's, of course, this intimately related biosurveillance agenda, this idea of making the internet of bodies and also, the internet of brains through the popularization of brain-computer interfaces a la Neuralink. And things like that. And it's all trying to have these systems interconnected so that they're all completely surveillable and that the data can be harvested en masse and exported to the same global database. And same thing like digital IDs and everything else. So you'll be, different people, but everything will be interoperable, right, between people, and all the data can be harvested and exported in the uniform format. So like with digital ID, you'll have different companies providing the digital ID, pervading an illusion of competition in the free market, but really they're, the same corporate people running it all. And all the data can be exported to the same thing. So it's functionally one digital ID system, right? And it's the same thing with like CBDCs and the private sector equivalents, like stable coins and things like that. It's all programmable, surveillable money, and it can all, they want to make all the wallets interoperable so all the data can be exported, all the surveillance data can be exported to the same place. And, that's what they want also for this stuff like Internet of Bodies, Internet of Brains. There's Neuralink, there's Synchron, there's all these different companies, but it's going to be interoperable at the end of the day. That's how they plan to do it. And ultimately,
like how in regard to the carbon overlap itself, just in your opinion, you could see these as completely separate, and maybe they are, but like, do you see that? In your opinion, do you think that the connection of like the W-band, the meshing of human bodies, the internet of nanobio things, and the brain discussion you just said, couldn't you argue that that's part of the same agenda, like in a real time sense, to be able to track whether it's just as simple as carbon usage or carbon tracking in general, or really that your bodies themselves are the production of it, and to control them and to influence them to track that? You see that as the same thing, or are they just kind of tangential?
I'm sure they'll integrate it at some point for sure. It's all meant to be part of the same system at the end of the day, for sure. Yeah, I mean, they want to make everything a currency in a sense,
Right.
in terms of like commodity based currency. It's going to get very weird, I think. But anyway, on the as far as the biosurveillance agenda goes, for a long time, this has all been about pre-crime. We've talked about this many times, Ryan, how there's the pre-crime agenda, predict crime before it happens, predict terrorist events before it happens, and also predict pandemics before they happen. We saw this a lot during COVID. But really, any sort of event, unexpected event X, how do we prevent that before it happens? There's a lot of this functionality there, and that's how they're justifying a lot of this invasive technology, whether it's in people, whether it's in nature, but that's why they need the traceability, and they want the algorithm to do predictive analytics on essentially everything. And it's all about control at the end of the day and trying to anticipate any sort of threats to their control before they can represent an actual real threat. And so they also want to go into the human mind directly and attack the way we perceive reality. And this is essentially discussed almost directly, really, in this book on AI that was authored by Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, who's a total ghoul, and Henry Kissinger, goes without saying, he was also a ghoul. And they talk about essentially how what AI is doing to people is cognitively diminishing people, so that people cannot live without AI, and will require AI to interpret information for them, that we won't be able to interpret reality ourselves without the help of a machine. And so they design that machine, they design that algorithm, and they can control how we perceive reality as we're perceiving it. They tell us how to perceive things. And they've been doing that for a long time to an extent with media psyops, but they want to go directly into people's brain and also essentially de-evolve us, to make us completely cognitively non-functional without their technology. And so the transhumanist stuff is part of that. But also, I mean, they're doing it to people through the algorithm now. People don't know, if you don't use it, you lose it. So people are dependent on Google Maps because there's no physical maps anymore. No one knows how to navigate without the phone. And there's numerous other examples, like calculator. Use their phone for the calculator, no actual little calculators, no mental math, whatever. It's all about trying to get people dependent on their technology. And that's how they plan to enslave us, is through our dependence on their technology. And they will use it as, both the carrot and the stick. You can't live without this. Now we've got you. And so we're really at a fork in the road here in how we approach this, because if we keep down that path of dependence, they will enslave us. So the goal is to get away from that as much as possible. And that obviously means something different for everybody.
Yeah. 100%.
Probably have to go, by the way.
Okay. Well, just on the way out, if you have to leave, that's, what should Republicans be thinking about this, or just right-minded people in regard to right-leaning minded people? What should they be thinking about? Go ahead.
So I think in general, regardless of whether you tend to be right-leaning or left-leaning, you need to stop looking for saviors, stop looking at celebrities, media celebrities, political celebrities, whatever, and realize what the global agenda is. It's summarized essentially in the Sustainable Development Goals, which really should be called Sustainable Debt Slavery Goals or Surveillance goals, or surveillance development goals. That's essentially what it's about. It's mass surveillance and it's mass debt slavery at a truly global scale. And once you know the policy agendas to look for, you should oppose the agendas regardless of who is selling it to you.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter if Biden's DHS is selling the smart wall, or if someone like Douglas McGregor on YouTube shows, or Brett Weinstein on Tucker Carlson's show is selling it. You should be opposed if you're opposed to digital ID and the surveillance paradigm that comes with it. If you're opposed to that, you should oppose it regardless of who's selling it to you. And you should look for at the agenda, not at the people selling it. Because if you're just focusing on the people, they'll be selling you all sorts of stuff. All those people can be compromised and be made to sell you whatever. There's media assets everywhere. And unfortunately, I think it's very clear that in the United States, the people they want to neutralize most as a threat are the people with guns, which tend to be the right-leaning Americans. And the way you neutralize that as a threat without firing a single shot is by making them think that they've won, so that they're compliant and obedient. And that is exactly what I think is going to be happening as the election moves forward. And, you know, these efforts to frame Trump as the savior become more and more overt. It's going to be very troubling. And of course, just like every election years, I'm sure you've brushed up against this as well. The whole thing is, oh, well, if you don't support Trump, you must support Biden. No, it's just like so annoying. And it's like every 4 years, regardless of like who's the guy coming in or coming out, whatever, you get accused of playing ball for the other side. And like, no, all the people involved here are corrupt and they're garbage, and they're going to sell you dystopian hell. When Trump was in office, he brought us Operation Warp Speed. He printed trillions of dollars and inflated the dollar. He allowed Fauci to lock down the country and like gave him an award and all of this stuff. And it's been framed on all these different ways. And there's been all these apologists trying to say, oh, it wasn't what it looked like. Yes, it was. They did this with Obama in the first term to sell us his second term. And it was the same bullshit the second time. And we can't afford to go through that with Trump to see if he'll drain the swamp this time. It's a fool's errand. It's no. And so if you care about the Constitution, care about the Constitution at the policy level and stop looking to these people to tell you what to believe.
Right.
If they're pushing policy agendas that are against the Constitution and you self-define as a constitutional conservative, you should oppose them, regardless of who's selling them. It doesn't matter if it's a media pundit that frames themselves as conservative or libertarian or whatever. What they're selling you isn't any of those things. They're trying to manufacture your consent for stuff that you would normally be against. So,
absolutely, well said. It's always war, surveillance, for Israel, lockstep all the time. We have to pay attention to that. So, thank you for joining me today, as always, and look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely.
Next time.
Thanks, Ryan. My pleasure. Thank you.